Week 10, The Psychology of Dehumanization. Hello, everyone. This week we are exploring one of the most important psychological mechanisms in the study of evil, dehumanization. Up to this point in the course, we have examined several layers that influence harmful behavior. We looked at personality traits like the dark triad. We explored situational pressures like conformity and obedience. And we examined systemic forces such as institutions, propaganda, and ideology. Now we are asking a deeper psychological question. How do people come to see other human beings as less than human? Because once that shift happens, the psychological barriers against harming others become much weaker. Understanding this process is essential if we want to understand genocide, discrimination, cruelty, and even everyday forms of moral exclusion. What is dehumanization? At its simplest level, dehumanization means perceiving another person or group as lacking the qualities that make someone fully human. This does not necessarily mean people consciously think these people are not human. More often it happens through subtle psychological shifts. For example, people may begin to see others as less capable of feeling, less capable of thinking, less morally worthy, or less deserving of empathy. Once these perceptions take hold, the normal emotional signals that prevent harm, things like empathy, guilt, and compassion, begin to weaken. Psychologists sometimes describe this as turning off the moral alarm system. 2 ways people dehumanize others. Research shows that people tend to deny humanness in 2 different ways. The first is called animalistic dehumanization. This happens when people describe others as primitive, savage, uncivilized, or driven by basic instincts. In this case, the target is viewed as less rational, less cultured, and more like an animal. Historically, this form of dehumanization has often appeared during ethnic conflicts, wars, and genocides. When groups are compared to animals, it becomes easier for others to justify violence against them. The second form is called mechanistic dehumanization. Here, people are not seen as animals, but as objects or machines. They are viewed as cold, interchangeable, and lacking individuality. You often see this in systems where people become numbers or cases instead of persons. Examples include extreme bureaucracies, certain technological environments, institutional settings, where human suffering becomes routine. In these situations, the emotional distance makes it easier for people to ignore harm. How moral judgment works. To understand why dehumanization is powerful, we need to look briefly at how people normally think about morality. Psychologists have found that moral thinking usually involves 2 roles: a moral agent, someone who acts and can cause harm; a moral patient, someone who can experience suffering. This simple structure helps us recognize when something wrong has happened. If someone intentionally harms someone who can suffer, we see it as morally wrong. But when people deny that others can suffer, or when they treat them as objects instead of persons, this moral structure collapses. If someone is no longer perceived as capable of suffering, harming them may not feel morally wrong anymore. This is one reason why dehumanization is such a powerful psychological tool. Measuring dehumanization. For a long time, psychologists believed people would never openly admit dehumanizing others. But more recent research has shown that this assumption was not always correct. In one well-known measure called the Ascent of Man scale, participants are asked to rate different groups on a scale ranging from less evolved to fully evolved humans. Disturbingly, some participants openly rate certain groups as less evolved. Even more concerning, these ratings strongly predict support for aggressive policies against those groups. This suggests that blatant dehumanization is not just a historical phenomenon, it still occurs today. Toxification, when groups become contaminants. One particularly dangerous form of dehumanization is called toxification. In this case, a group is portrayed not simply as inferior, but as dangerous or contaminating. They may be described as parasites, diseases, infestations, threats to the purity or safety of society. Once a group is framed as a contamination, violence can begin to appear not as cruelty, but as cleaning or purification. History shows that this type of language often appears before mass violence. It prepares people psychologically to accept extreme actions. The cycle of reciprocal dehumanization. Dehumanization often spreads through a cycle. One group begins to believe another group sees them as less than human. Psychologists call this meta-dehumanization. Even if the perception is inaccurate, the belief that another group dehumanizes you can trigger retaliation. Then both groups increasingly view each other as enemies or threats. This cycle can escalate quickly. Once it begins, empathy collapses on both sides. Why this matters. The most unsettling insight from this research is that dehumanization does not require monstrous personalities. It often emerges from ordinary psychological processes, categorizing people into groups, exaggerating differences, repeating hostile narratives, reducing empathy toward outsiders. These processes are common in everyday social life, but when they are amplified by political systems, propaganda, or social fear, they can become extremely dangerous. Questions for your seminar. As you prepare for your seminar discussions, I would encourage you to explore several questions more deeply. First, how does dehumanization interact with the other concepts we have studied in this course? For example, how does dehumanization interact with the dark triad? How might narcissistic leaders or manipulative personalities use dehumanizing narratives to mobilize groups? Second, how does dehumanization relate to situational pressures like conformity and obedience? If authority figures or social groups normalize dehumanizing language, how does that change individual moral judgment? Third, how does systemic structure reinforce dehumanization? Are there institutional arrangements that make it easier to stop seeing people as individuals? Think about bureaucracy, propaganda, and ideological systems. Finally, what protects people from dehumanizing others? What psychological factors help individuals maintain a sense of shared humanity, even under pressure? Understanding that question may be one of the most important parts of studying the psychology of evil. Closing. The study of dehumanization reminds us of something deeply important. The line between humanity and cruelty is not maintained automatically. It requires attention, reflection, and moral awareness. The moment we stop recognizing the humanity of others, the psychological barriers against harm begin to weaken. And that is why understanding this process is so essential, not only for psychology, but for society itself. I look forward to hearing your seminar discussions this week.